Welcome back to the Product Builders Podcast. Today's conversation is a bit of a time warp, and I mean that in the best way possible. We're talking about what it's like to lead product inside a company that's older than the United States, and it's building its tech entirely in-house. Our guest is Samantha McCarthy, AVP of Product Management at Sotheby's, a name that brings to mind prestige, heritage, and high-end art auctions. But behind all of that is a rapidly evolving digital ecosystem that powers the entire business, and Sam has had a front row seat to see how that's all come together. Samantha, welcome to the show. It's great having you. Before we dive into the world of auction tech and platform strategy, I want to rewind a little bit. I always love hearing the personal side of how people got into product. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Of course. Thanks so much for the intro, Mark. I'm really excited to kind of talk about this a little bit. I'll just dive into it. So, I guess how I got to where I am today, it's one of those things that I look back and I can kind of see how this all happened. But in the middle of it, I was just like, what am I doing? I studied in kind of like a architecture and urban planning adjacent degree when I was in undergrad. I was really interested in how people use space and how, we shape our live spaces and they shape us, which I think foreshadows a little bit how we build products. We really want to care about how people use them and also how products shape people. So that kind of, I think, laid some of the groundwork for how I ended up in product. And ultimately, I realized going through this that I didn't really want to be in architecture. I was really interested in music and culture and really wanted to know how to get involved in getting people access to that stuff. So, I ended up working in the music industry, a bunch of different jobs, ended up at a music startup, and kind of the rest is history. And that kind of evolved into the art world. That's kind of how I got to Sotheby's today. And I've been here, I want to say, coming on 5 years now, which is pretty wild.
Not uncommon from a lot of other product people and leaders that I've spoken to who come from just a wide background and different expertise. But what drew you to the world of product, especially in such a unique space like the arts?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of this is true of it. Like any industry, you dig deep enough and there are interesting problems to solve, right? But I think there's something about people care so much about music and art, and it's really intangible in certain ways. And solving problems for experiences like that is just really interesting. Like I've run into problems that we've had to solve at Sotheby's that have been like, where else in the world is anyone thinking about this? Like just as an example, we sold an NFT that was a single pixel. How do you display that to somebody on a website? It is literally a single pixel. You cannot make it any bigger. Like where else are you solving that kind of a problem? And that's just a little, a little anecdote on, some of the kinds of like sometimes bizarre problems, but they're really interesting. And you get to kind of think about these things that like really wouldn't happen anywhere.
Yeah, I might circle back to that anecdote later because I am curious to know how you did solve for that. And so you mentioned earlier that you've been with the company for about 5 years now. Can you talk about what it was like within the organization then and compared to where it is today and how things have evolved?
Sure. So I joined at a kind of an odd time. It was mid 2020. Everybody was really scrambling to adjust to being fully remote. And I think when I joined, I was lucky in that Sotheby's has already been evolving as a product organization for a couple of years. A couple of years before I joined, I think product had largely been focused on using tech as kind of advertising and, just promoting what we were selling. We didn't really do transactions online. Most of our tech was around inventory management and marketing, and finances, obviously. But when I joined, we'd already started moving away from that. There was a lot of interest in like, how do we invest in technology to, improve our client experiences, to kind of own more of the process. We know people are moving online and getting more comfortable purchasing things online. How do we do that? How do we accommodate that? So by the time I joined, we'd already started experimenting a little bit with, we'd built the first iterations of our auction engine so people could fully experience an auction online. We had online auctions fully for the first time. And then 2020 happened, and then this was just fuel on the fire,
Yeah.
So it really, I think, that period really let the product team shine, and our engineering partners and design folks that, we really need to get to be able to kind of build our own tools this way. And so that precipitated like pretty rapid amount of growth within our product org, and maturing as well. And so we started out pretty small. I want to say like there were maybe 7 PMs. That's doubled at this point, and we've got, we're definitely pretty scrappy when I joined. I remember laughing after one of my interviews with them because someone's like, "Yeah, like working in product at Sotheby's is like being at a startup." And I was like, "This company's nearly 300 years old. Like, how is it possibly like a
We are
startup?"
not a
But they were
startup.
actually, yeah, but they were honestly like more right than I realized.
Right.
It was pretty scrappy. There's obviously a lot of things the business wanted to do. We had like the prioritization was really challenging because there was so much going on. But we've grown since then. We've got some frameworks and more structure involved. Still a little scrappy at times. But we've been able to grow the kind of the relationship that we also have with the rest of the business, which is really critical. And so they're also able to see us more as partners now, whereas before it was a bit of an odd kind of relationship where people, I think, because again, this isn't a traditional tech company, right?
Right.
A lot of people aren't used to, they're like, I don't get involved in developing technology. I'm a consumer of it. And so the relationship was very much, you just build things for us and we use them, not we're a partner and can kind of help decide what is being built,
Mhm.
help solve the problems together. And that's kind of how I think it's changed quite a lot since then in that way.
That's really interesting. And so, just in a few years alone, you've seen quite a bit of
Mhm.
transformation firsthand. And also, just hearing about your background is always really fascinating, and to hear how those experiences have shaped where you are today. But that said, I do want to get into something that you just started getting into. Sotheby's is not your typical tech org. You, I think, have mentioned you don't even consider yourselves a tech company or a startup, and yet you're operating like one. So there's very clearly intentional product thinking happening. So, how do you think about driving innovation at a company that doesn't necessarily see itself that way as a tech company?
Yeah. I think so much of it is about positioning and communication.
Yeah.
Obviously, Sotheby's is so much about brand. Um, and what that translates to is I think, we know everyone's heard, what is it, like customer obsession as
Yep.
popularized by Amazon. Um, and we almost take that to an absurd degree because people think Sotheby's and obviously fine art, super high value objects, there's a degree of expectation of like white glove, right? So
Right.
everything needs to be the most like pristine, beautiful, whatever. So it goes a lot into like how we have to position ourselves here. Like everything is actually very much about the client. How does this impact the client experience? Um, and going back to how, I mentioned that we needed to develop this into like a partnership is a lot of people don't know what it's like to work in tech. And it took me a while to get there to understand how to talk to other people within the business in a way that they understood what I was doing. Like when you do, when, and I realized it was kind of like if I met someone on the street and had to explain to them what I do every day, not they're not. I don't know very much about where they're coming from, what their background is. They may be an engineer, they may not be, and meeting them where they are and asking the right questions to understand where they're coming from and what their level of understanding is, and then what I have to do to meet them there. Also giving outs to people like if I'm explaining, I think something that's been really effective for me from both like, and I've experienced this with both talking to folks in the C-suite down to like an intern is if I'm over explaining something and you already know what I'm talking about, tell me because then I can, like
Right.
I don't want you to feel like I'm talking down to you. I don't want you to feel like I'm over explaining. And letting them know that you're trying to accommodate where they're at, I think is really, really beneficial and helps people understand. And it makes it easier for people to be like, oh, I can work with you and I can start to understand what technology does, how it works for me. It's a lot of like translation and communication, I think.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, even within tech companies and product teams, there is sometimes a gap between leadership who might not be technical leadership or technical founders, and then the actual product team. And now you're talking about an entire company that's not necessarily founded on technology, right? So you mentioned a lot of communication and translation. I mean, are there good ways or things that you do that you found work well when translating the work you do to like non-technical teams, people, leadership, etc.?
Yes. Yeah. Analogies have been a huge one for me. I actually have Figma with all the various analogies that I've tried and experimented with, and what's worked with who and which teams, and I think it's really helped people kind of understand like how things work. And I think particularly because the team that I work with, so um, I run part of our platform service organization, which is pretty technical, and the vast majority of the people at Sotheby's will have really like don't know what an API is, and that's totally fine. They don't need to know what that is. I also don't know a whole lot about, I don't know some crazy art history stuff that's just like not my wheelhouse. But how do I translate what I'm doing so that they care about it and they can express their opinion in a way that I can therefore use it and build more products? So analogies have been really helpful. Some of the platform services I've kind of described it as, it's like if you have a city, again, kind of maybe this is foreshadowing my academics, but if you have a city needs electricity and water. I can supply those tools to you. I don't particularly care how you use them, but you need them
Right.
and I can give you those resources. And that's what we do. And like, so that's actually something that that's a real analogy that I've used and I've seen it was effective and I've seen, leadership reuse it and use it to talk to other people about like, this is what our product team is doing. And it's cool to be able to see that. But it did have to go, I'd had to iterate on that one a little bit on like what actually lands. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'd love to see that Figma dictionary of
there's some
analogies. It's
pretty weird
always,
ones trying all kinds of stuff.
on the throwing back to another episode, I had someone equate product management to a salad and how each thing has each ingredient has a different purpose and flavor,
Yep.
very independent, but altogether it works. And I was like, wow, I'm going to use that. That's such a great analogy. So maybe a future project to create a dictionary that you
Okay.
have consolidated. And so, kind of getting back to my original question. So, Sotheby's, right? It's known for prestige, brand heritage. I'm sure as a company with a lot of years of experience behind it, they just are set in certain ways that they do something. How does the legacy and prestige of Sotheby's influence product building?
Yeah.
In what ways does those traditions and workflows have to be considered in the work that you do?
Um, so obviously, I think, like I said earlier, brand is a huge thing. So anything that touches a client, interacts with a client interacts with us, has to be very much in line with what those expectations are, right? And if anything, they need to exceed expectations. We cannot, you know, we just can't deliver products that are subpar, that are confusing. And I think more than anything, the difference with the difference from other companies that I've worked at and more kind of like, I want to say like a traditional tech company is that because of who our clients are, we actually have a pretty small pool of clients. We don't
Yeah.
have, given the price points of what we sell, not accessible to a lot of people. So unlike something like say Facebook, where, you have millions and millions and millions of users, and you can actually afford to burn a couple users with a new product rollout. We cannot afford to do that.
Right.
So in some ways we're very conservative around the changes that we make, or there's a lot of additional work that we have to do in the back end to ensure that things are more stable than you would ever expect them to be, or just have contingency plan upon contingency plan, including contingency plans that are, can we do it on paper? Um, So there's a lot, there's considerations there, but it's because, it's all in service of like the experience that our clients have to have. And I think, this goes beyond just the usual, like, yeah, you have to consider the client's experience. Yeah.
You're operating at such an interesting dichotomy of like opposites. You've got,
Hmm.
a very traditional legacy company, but you're operating almost like a startup
Yeah.
in-house with technology. And you're trying to move fast, but of course there's the brand. So you have to move slowly, make sure nothing breaks. So it's really just, I can't imagine what it's like to see those two worlds push up against each other as you push out product. But that's what let's switch gears a bit. So I think one of the most interesting parts as we planned for this conversation was how you have evolved from using client-facing tools to more platform level thinking,
Hmm.
if you will, and making this decision as a brand to build versus buy. And
Right.
that's a huge shift that I know a lot of companies consider and not every company makes.
Mhm.
So, what are some of the benefits of building proprietary tools in-house versus buying off the shelf, especially when your competitors, have taken a different route? Why did you guys choose to build?
Yeah. I think a lot of it starts with, you think about how people are used to, and this is just kind of how I think like the market works in a lot of ways. Mm. The vast majority of ways in which we purchase things online, people are used to direct to consumer. People are used to you just buy things outright. Most of us have probably never participated in an auction. And it's not necessarily the most ideal way for most things to be sold. And most of us have never even necessarily negotiated the purchase of goods, right? And so there's actually not a lot of products out there that support those types of buying. There are some,
Yeah.
obviously, and we know, like you mentioned, some of our competitors do use, I guess, what you might call out of the box tools.
Okay.
But this again goes back to risk for us, right? Like auction is our bread and butter. We need to own absolutely every step of the process. We want to own all of that data. The risk of that data being exposed is a huge problem because we have client data that goes into this. Every person that bids on things, we need to have that information. And some of these are like ultra high net worth individuals. So being able to own all of that, I think, gives us a degree of security. And to be completely transparent, when we first rolled this out, there were absolutely disasters that happened. It was not always smooth sailing, but we've
Yeah.
gotten to a place now that it's been really, mm, uh, we're pretty stable now. But this kind of feeds into, your question about how we've moved to platform. And this ties very much in with how the org has matured over the last like 5 years that I've been there, is that we're starting to see, data is king. Obviously, I think we all know
Mhm.
this. And again, with a business as tenured as we are, there's a lot of data that we have that's pretty messy. And moving to a state where we have application teams that can develop fast and iterate, like you again, we can move fast with how the markets are changing, demands of the business. We need to pivot that can go and do that. While some of the really critical kind of like data problems are around how do we understand who our clients are? How do we understand the individual objects that we're working with? Um, that's something that every application needs. And so we felt it made sense to abstract those things out from the application teams. They shouldn't have to worry about like, am I using the right client ID? Because we historically had like, I don't know how many. You just have
Right.
one, like those
Right.
are problems that like make our lives a lot easier and also ultimately make, again, our clients' lives better, right? Because they have a smoother experience. So that's kind of how we've evolved mm, over the last 5 years, I guess. And that's some of the decision making behind that is it's really important for us to own all of our data. Mm. And
Right.
also, own the process and the workflows for all of this too.
And you said most people haven't participated in an auction. I've actually had the ability to go to an auction house. I didn't participate in an auction, but they showed me the kind of tech and the setup and how people would be online
Yeah.
making bids, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
Let's backtrack. Can you paint the picture of like what does your portfolio of technology look like, and how does this tech play a role in what you do for people who have no idea how
Yeah.
tech is utilized?
So It is kind of an interesting, I mean, I also highly encourage anyone that's listening to, you can watch some of our, what we call our marquee sales live. They're live streamed. So you can watch some of these really incredible artworks go to auction. And you can start to see how much of a performance some of it is and how dynamic a lot of it is also, because you obviously, there's an interesting friction between, this is a live thing that's happening. It's incredibly immediate. You have a person that's standing up front. There's people in the room. And then you also have people online. So how do you kind of accommodate those two things at the same time? You have the auctioneer who's trying to make sure that they're catching all the bids online while seeing someone in the audience is also bidding on something. Um, so there are tools that we have that, we have a display that will tell them as, online bids are coming in so they don't miss them. Also
Mm.
translates all of that into the various currencies that we need to be aware of. They have an iPad that will help them keep track of like, which lot are we on? A lot being art industry lingo for whatever is on the block at that moment.
Got
What
it.
are we selling right then? Mm. And then, if there's any changes that happen, because like sometimes, someone will pull a piece of art last minute and then we don't sell it. Nobody gets to put a bid in. How do we accommodate that? The content that gets associated with the pieces, because we need to know, who is the creator, what are the photos that we have for it, any video that's been made, all of that needs to come together. So there's so many different pieces that we need to kind of build in. And again, kind of goes back to, there's not a lot of like out of the box technology that accommodates a lot of that. So again, it made a lot of sense for us to kind of build it ourselves because we know exactly what we need.
Yeah, the more I hear you talk about the different and unique things that you have to solve for, I'm like, what would you even like Google search for if you're trying to find that platform?
Yeah.
But speaking to that point, you're working with functionality that again is unique to your space. You're working with individuals that are highly specific, high net worth. Um, can you talk a little bit about unique product considerations you have to think about when building these tools, especially when you've got, let's say, the high net worth individual, and then you also have someone in the space managing that. I don't know the terminology, but they're taking those bids online and bidding in real world. I imagine there's just such different challenges than maybe other product spaces.
I do think a lot of it comes down to how uh, there is still a large component of face-to-face interaction. And this, I mean, I think this has always been an interesting space to operate in, right? Is the technology that kind of bridges the gap with like online versus real world. I mean,
Mm,
online is real world these days, but mm, but the physical world, I guess, because yeah, like if we were just fully doing things online, like that's what eBay does. There's plenty, like we have a lot of mm, spaces now that sell luxury goods online, and they figured that out. And we also have to consider them to be competitors to a degree. Um, but they don't do kind of like the live real time piece.
yeah.
And that's something that I think we've had to really consider is actually this is a problem that we've was really difficult to solve and not necessarily difficult, but like something that we've really had to make sure we got right was how do we deliver all of this real time? Because if you're lagging in your live stream or if our website is lagging in the newest bid and you're trying to bid online, you could miss something.
Right.
We would end up with an incredibly unhappy client who's like, I bid on that thing and then you missed it or somebody else got the bid because it took another 2 seconds for it to load. It has to be real time. So like that's something that I think, most retail spaces absolutely don't have to worry about too much, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not competitive. And that's the other piece. Mm, if you're buying a pair of, there's a sneaker drop, and you're buying things online. If you're just not online, like if you're just not there fast enough and there's no like there's no person that's parceling out who gets the last pair of sneakers. It's all kind of
Right.
calculated and you can't be like, well, you messed up. I didn't get the thing that I wanted. But that's something that we have to accommodate is, yeah, like the urgency of it, I think is a big thing that we have to consider.
What does user testing and QA look like when you do have to connect both the digital and this like
Mhm.
physical experience? Is there a lot of testing that goes into that and like mock auctions just to see if things are functioning correctly?
Yeah, so our auction engine and platform has been pretty stable for a little while now, so we haven't had to do as many. It's also, once we got to this state, is like we don't touch it too much these days.
Right.
But I want to say when I first joined, the first couple years, there were every time there was new stuff, we would run, mock auctions. Just we would work with our auctioneers to kind of run through it, so they felt the cadence and understood how this was working. So we really had to bring in like our staff and users to kind of experience it and make sure that things were all running fine. Also, just honestly, like analytics out the wazoo. Everything we need to be making sure everything's got alerts set up if things are moving slow. How do we make sure that we accommodate it? Um, Also, again, this kind of goes back to all the contingency plans. What happens if what happens if the internet goes out and we just don't have
Right.
it? Mm. So a lot of testing and then a lot of planning around what do we do if, things go wrong, because that's always unfortunately something that you have to plan for.
Yeah. And one more question here. But when you think about other tech and product teams and you
Mhm.
think about innovating and feature iteration, et cetera, a lot of that is centered around how can we make this experience more novel or interesting or kind of high impact using the
Mhm.
latest technology. I imagine because breaking something in your system would have a much larger impact than again, like something low stakes. Like, what does innovation look like at your team, or what does feature iteration look like there? Is it a lot more considered? Are you just trying to do the most basic level of functionality, or are you innovating in different ways?
I think a lot of the innovations that we have to do with the data that we're working with. That's kind of, I
Hmm.
think, where a lot of it comes down to. I also just probably a little biased here, but I work specifically with a lot of our object data. So that's understanding the individual pieces of art that come through, the luxury items that come through. So it's like, well, we have nearly 300 years worth of data. What do we do with it?
That's a lot of data.
And to be fair, a lot of it is like pretty messy. A lot of it's
Right.
like, how do we get this off of a piece of paper? How do we get this off of like some, super elaborate handwriting script? Like, so some of it is like that. But um, the big challenge and like the where we want to innovate right now is like, what do we do with our data? How do we understand the objects that we're selling? Can we be predictive with it? Both for our clients so that they can, we get more and more people online these days. How do you sell products that are one of ones to essentially what are one of one people? Mm, You know, there's not like we sell works where there's maybe like six people in the world that are interested in buying it.
Mm.
So not necessarily innovation in like the traditional sense, but solving for some of these problems that are really, and a lot of them are data problems. So I think it's really figuring out how do we use our data to inform ourselves better to solve these like really unique things.
That's great. Such a different space and such
Yeah.
a different way of thinking that again, I'm not used to, but it's really interesting to hear about. But I'd love to zoom out a bit and talk about some maybe bigger picture stuff and what you've learned along the way and advice you'd share. So, like looking back in this journey that has led you
Mhm.
here to Sotheby's, what's something you wish you had known maybe first when you first started at Sotheby's? If you can give yourself advice to Samantha 2020.
Yeah. I think there's maybe two things. I think the first one is, and this, I think when I got my head around this, things started to really kind of drop into place, I think when I joined, I was kind of like, we're just selling stuff. Like how much more complicated could it be?
Right.
And it's just not that, right? Like it's not like you log on to Nike.com and you can buy whatever inventory. Realizing that, and then also realizing again, kind of what I was saying is that there is a performance and a drama and an immediacy to a lot of the auction experience that goes into how we think about things that I think really impacts not just, and we haven't talked that much about this, but like not just how we build products, but how we work with the rest of the business as well and how they can understand what we're doing is really crucial. So I think that's probably the first piece is like, this is not going to be like any other retail product experience that you've encountered. Um, and then I think the second piece is uh, the I think the breadth of communication and
Oh,
kind of that's a skill that is going to need to be honed and refined to an absolute razor's edge. Because I think the scale of communication that I've had to do both, because obviously, I'm more of a manager now, but like I was in
yeah.
IC and was working really closely with engineers and having to translate, do all the kind of requirements gathering and understand things so that they could build the things that we needed. But again, working with folks that have absolutely no idea how would you develop a thing? I don't know. And being able to bridge that gap. And I know that's something that every product manager has to do. But I felt this personally more acutely here than anywhere else because the rest of the business isn't thinking about technology 24/7. They don't really know most of them probably don't know what our roadmaps are. But they still, really need that information so that they can operate. They know what we can sell. They know how we can sell it.
Yeah.
And being able to kind of communicate both up and down the degrees of knowledge is really crucial. I think um, an understanding of I think it's called um, the curse of knowledge bias, if you're familiar with that, of, where
I've
someone,
heard of it.
yeah, so it's like where someone has really specialist knowledge, assumes that other people also
Yeah.
know all the specialist knowledge. And obviously we all know that not everybody has the same, is working with the same tool set that we have, but um, it becomes very, very apparent, particularly given, we're all specialists in the work that we do, but not
Yeah.
everybody else has that. And being able to overcome that, I think, uh, was really something that realizing that was really important for me.
That's great. And you mentioned something earlier which made me thought of this question. So backtracking a little bit, but what does success look like for your team? Is it making that sale successfully? Are there deeper KPIs that you're looking at? How do you quantify a successful feature launch,
Mhm.
whatever it might be?
So that's interesting because that's actually shifted quite a bit since my team's become more of our platform team, and it's our users are other product teams. So that has changed quite a bit. It used I previously the team that I was running previously was more around a lot of our internal tools. So a lot of our KPIs were around adoption, speed of people's ability to execute tasks, that kind of a thing. Now it's very much about things like data quality. We have to assess the data that we're working with and how good is it, which is kind of difficult to figure out sometimes. Um, so that's
I bet.
something that we've been working on building is like how do we know not just that our services are working, but the data that we're delivering through those services is of a usable and not just usable, but like of a high caliber. Um, so that the teams that are consuming it can actually do something with it and it's effective. So that's kind of where these things kind of center now for my team. Um, yeah.
I feel like this conversation could be twice as long because I'm so interested to hear all about the nuances of working within your space. But we're coming up on time. I know we've covered a lot today. Before I let you go, I like to wrap up every episode with a few fun questions to keep it light.
Sure.
I'm going to throw out maybe 2 or 3 statements your way. Just want your quick take on them, kind of
Mhm.
gut reaction in a couple seconds. All right. Here, let's pick some fun ones. All right. Do you have a favorite category at Sotheby's in terms
Oh,
of product?
in terms of like product or like what, like the stuff that we sell.
In terms of the stuff that you sell, yeah.
Oh man, that's an easy one. We have a science and technology team, and they do fossil auctions a couple
Oh,
times a year. So like we'll end up with like a T-Rex skeleton in the lobby, and those are Like, if anyone from Sotheby's listens to this, they're probably going to be a little bit, miffed by that. But I love the fossils, dinosaurs.
Did not even know that those were up for
They're
auction.
very
Uh,
cool. Also, pro tip: you could totally walk into the office and look at stuff. Like, it's just there. So,
that's cool. All right, this might be redundant, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there a single object that you've come across in your time at Sotheby's that you still think about?
I think there's a couple. I mentioned the Pixel that we sold. That's like, and it's, I guess the two things that I think about are in the same category because the other one is we recently sold this. I think people probably saw some of the marketing and news around it. It was the banana, that also known as the comedian. Um, it's interesting I imagine there's people that are like, how are these two things the same, the single pixel and the banana? But they're just, it's just, I just find it to be an interesting commentary on the art space. It's funny. You can't take it too seriously. It's weird. So I enjoy that.
Let me do one more here before we wrap things up. Bridging the gap, bridging the art world and your digital PM experience. What's something you've learned about this space that you're in that has just really surprised you and that you weren't prepared for?
I think I'd probably say that, I don't know, this maybe sounds like an obvious one, and I imagine that if I was also in any other industry, but the depth of knowledge that our specialists have, and
Um,
that also again sounds really obvious. Like most of these people have art history backgrounds, but um, it's always surprised me how deeply passionate a lot of these folks are about the things that they work with. And again, it shouldn't be a surprise really, but it's always it's wonderful working with people that care so much
yeah.
about these things and care so much about art and the history behind it. It's, yes, I think one of the things that I enjoy the most about working here.
Awesome. Thank you for playing along with that. It's one of my favorite segments of the show. But before we call it a day, we like to wrap things up with what we call our Majesytk Bite. If listeners can walk away from this episode today with one key takeaway, what would you leave them with?
I think honestly, communication is everything. Communicate with empathy. Try to meet people where they're at as much as they can. I think, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Awesome. Sam, thank you so much. This was such a thoughtful and energizing conversation. And thanks for giving us a sneak peek into a space that many of us don't get to see. I love how you made a lot of these ideas really clear and relevant, and really interesting, especially for those who don't work in auctions or luxury. We'll include links to you and Sotheby's in the show notes. And I know our listeners are going to walk away with a new appreciation for what it means to build modern products in legacy spaces. For those of you tuning in, thanks as always for listening in. If you found this episode helpful, give us a follow, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who you think will find this interesting. This is the Product Builders Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me.